This is my 2JZ swap Toyota Celica. And this is the story from start to present day on how I built this machine. So how this whole build started is I bought a 2001 Toyota Celica GTS with a 2ZZ motor, brought it back home, and it was not running. That's the condition I knew it was in, and the previous owner had issues getting it running. Cylinder 2 decided to not only eat the intake valves, but spit them back out the intake because it did not like them. I, after finding out the motor was blown, started stripping the interior. I pulled the old motor. I then went all in on the 2JZ swap idea and bought a 2JZ GE VVTi engine off of eBay. I stripped it down to just the piston and crank and rebuilt it with GTE rods. One of them actually came up with a broken off ringland. The person I ordered it from shipped me a new piston and I swapped it onto the rod. I then rebuilt most of the block, not redoing the crank or most of the head, but I did redo a lot of the seals, and I ended up upgrading some stuff like changing the intake manifold so that it would fit better with the setup I was going with, the idea I had. I also installed a turbo exhaust manifold with a 70mm turbo and 1000cc fuel injectors to try and keep up with that. I also removed a lot of the accessories, which was partially a mistake I made, what I realized later. And with that, I also stripped down the wiring harness to use a lot of those connectors and plugs. After I finished building the motor, I purchased a G35 rear subframe. Partial downside of that is the lug pattern on the rear no longer matched the front because it switched from 5x100 to 5x114.3. I ended up adapting the Celica rear strut to the control arm where the spring normally sits. So I ended up buying a PMC transmission adapter kit, and that came with an aluminum flywheel and friction material. I also found out on accident later that I perfectly spaced the rear subframe and the engine mount so that when I had the transmission installed, an automatic transmission 350C drive shaft fits. I had planned on cutting it up and making it fit with steel and welding it, but it just fits, so luckily I didn't have to do any extra work. I had to cut the front subframe in half and make room to fit where the flywheel bell housing area goes. I also ended up cutting the front radiator support, the bottom of it. Finally lowered the car down onto its own weight for the first time with a 2JZ mounted in it. Now, because I had to cut the subframe, I had to relocate where the sway bar went on the front end and the steering rack. And my way of doing that was I took the knuckles and struts from the Celica and swapped sides so that they were backwards, which put the actual pivot angle or steering, that ended up on the front of the knuckle instead of on the back or behind the axle. Because the drive shaft went through where the original fuel tank would go, I switched to a 17-liter fuel cell, I believe, and a external fuel pump and filter. I had a ton of fuel leaks. I later fixed that with the correct O-rings and fittings. I also had to make a new wiring harness out of the old one and new wire to adapt it to a Haltech Elite 750. And in that, I ended up frying the first ECU I got for it. That was because I had wired the original GE coils to the ECU, and then I later switched to LS2 coil packs. Had a ton of issues getting those working because I didn't understand what I was doing. I'd never wired an ECU before, but I eventually figured it out and I got it all running and sparking. And the main issue with why it wasn't sparking was because of the crank position sensor. Being the motor was in the front and sticking out a little farther forward than the original, I ended up putting the radiator in the rear, and I ran galvanized steel lines from the front to the back. Later in the process, once the motor was mounted, I also used old exhaust tubing and welded up some charge pipes for the front end and mounted the intercooler. This was because I had a flux core MIG welder. In testing the spark and fuel and trying to get the engine to run, I ended up finding a lot of oil leaks, including both cam seals, the inlet and outlet for the turbo. Originally when starting it, my friend noted there was sparking. Turns out I had finger tight the nut for the starter and it was very loose after testing it a bit. So this has now been 3 years in the build. I originally was working on it for about a year and a half, pretty consistently, but then I moved into an apartment and the car wasn't stored there. That was a whole poor situation. But then once I bought my house, I moved it into the garage. It sat a little bit while I was getting everything settled in and going. And then I continued work on it. And that's where I fixed the coil issues that I was having and tried starting it again. And this was a huge feeling of relief because, again, I had never been below the valve cover in engine before, and this thing ran the first time I built it. So that was pretty cool to see and hear. Now, the reason it was running very rich is a few things. Obviously, a bad tune. I'm guessing the fuel injectors could be different than the listing said that I bought them, so I might do a flow test on them. Put an O2 sensor in narrowband just so that the ECU can see it, and that'll help. I can't really afford a wideband right now. I didn't run it for long at any point, no longer than like 5-7 minutes, because there was no coolant and no alternator. I wasn't really worried about draining the battery, but I was very worried about overheating. Got the automatic transmission drive shaft, installed that. I built a full 3-inch exhaust from the turbo back. Sounds pretty cool. At this point, this is when I actually removed the engine to fix the oil leaks and crank spacer and that. I also fixed a fuel leak because originally how I had the line going into the rail, that ended up stripping out because I was trying to adapt threads that weren't the same. So I switched to a banjo bolt setup. I had wired up the alternator, but still no belt, so it's still not running. I put the front end on because originally I don't think I had the charge pipes on. I bled the clutch and brakes with a friend, then realized I forgot to put the pads in the brake calipers, so it was just spewing fluid out. So put them back together, put pads in. I had everything ready to go, ready to drive, and I tried starting it, wouldn't want to start, and then it started, wouldn't really idle. But I got it to idle long enough for me to get in the car and flip it and keep it running. I was able to back it out of the garage, but I decided it was not running good enough and I just pulled it back in. I then adjusted the tune settings a bit, just seeing what might be going wrong because it was obviously still running either rich or lean, but I couldn't see because the exhaust was now behind me. And I couldn't see out there whether the smoke was not there or it was pitch black. After a few days, I ended up working on it some more and tried test driving it again. So I pulled it out of the garage. It was idling. I was getting really excited because I now had brakes and it was a running idling engine. So put it in first gear and I drove it down the street. It moved and it was so much fun. I was able to shift gears, listen to the engine, pass a few cars because they were picking up kids from school. And then I found out the brakes weren't working. So I had to take things very easy because it would not slow down unless I shut off the engine or let out or pushed in the clutch, and it just gradually slowed down. And because of that, I also found out it bottoms out over speed bumps because the engine is heavier than the original engine and transmission. Also, when you turn, it likes to pull you into the turn and keep you there, and you have to like fight it out of it because of the suspension issues and steering. I think it's towed in too much, but I was able to put it back on the concrete pad right next to the garage, and I did a little burnout. Not much, but I was able to do a little one. And then I shut it off because it was getting hot at this point. It also, from that, ended up turning the exhaust purple, which I think is pretty cool, almost like the titanium effect. Now that first test drive taught me a lot, as in I've learned a lot with this build and a lot about cars and how they work in this because I had to figure out every aspect of it. I also realized that I needed an O2 sensor to try and help with the tune and at least gauge roughly where the fuel was. Now, other than the little mechanical tidbits, like I still need to finish the cooling lines and test that, make sure it's not leaking, and put a belt on the alternator, make sure that's working. The only other stuff I really need to do now is finish it, just mainly body work. The wheels on it right now, the rears are actually a little too close in tolerance where they hit the strut, but I think even just a 1/4-inch spacer should fix that. And I'd also like to install a passenger seat so I can show friends the build and give them rides. Now, I do plan on doing a roll cage at minimum, adding structure to support the trans tunnel, being one of the main beams in the center of the car is now cut in half. Also with the bodywork, I would like to redo the headlights and taillights. I do like the headlights as a concept. I think how I executed them gives the idea but was poorly executed, so I might get new housings and redo them, or just stick with these ones for now as a proof of concept and see if I can get someone professionally to make them for me. Now, would I recommend doing something like this? Hell yeah. This was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot about how vehicles work because, like I said, nothing below the valve cover. I knew what a spark plug was. I had an idea what a piston was. I'd seen the diagrams and videos, but I'd never touched any of it. I had never physically seen any of it. I never saw how it works with other parts. So I had no idea. But now I built a fully running motor in a car that never came with it, and it drives under its own power, which is pretty fucking cool. Now, it's not the most financially responsible and best thing to do. I've been trying to budget this, but you're not gonna get the same money out of it as you would put into it. It's more of a passion thing. And that's what it is to me, is I like these cars, I like the Celica, and I think it came underpowered in the 7th gen. It could have been really cool. I think it looks the best, but it just got the shorthand of the stick, so that's why I decided to put the 2J in it. Now, coming to reality a little bit, yes, this is great to build and a lot of fun and very impressive. At least I'm impressed with myself on it. It's a lot, honestly. Like, mentally, it was draining. The coil packs, that took about 9 months for me to figure out, given that was off and on, but consistently that was at least like 3 months straight. Think of putting in like 3-4 hours a day for 3 months straight on just one thing. I was losing my mind, and whenever I'd research it, it was a simple answer of just do this, just do that I was doing, and it just wouldn't work. I still don't know where it went wrong originally, but now it works. I did it how online said after I had tried that originally and it wasn't working, but now it's working, and I understand it is. I had never built any of this before, so I didn't understand. But with that, I do think it was worth it, even though I lost my mind a few times working on it, to the point where I can note about 6 times I had debated selling the car in an unfinished condition, like almost this point condition. I wanted to sell the car because it was hurting me mentally more than it was worth working. But I stuck with it, just gave myself a little break, went back to it, and got it figured out. Now it runs. And honestly, I feel like I've grown a lot stronger mentally and emotionally because of it, because it stressed me out so much. So I bet you're all curious though too. This is a 2JZ motor in a Celica, which is like, you can find a video or a few on them online, but cost-wise, I spent around $4,500 building the motor. That is a 2JZ GE engine with a turbo and GTE rods. I'm on a budget. I don't have a lot of money. I literally work at Walmart. You can do pretty cool stuff too if you put your mind to it. But in total, at this point in time, what has effectively gotten it to this point, I have spent $10,777 on this build. On the other end, I also spent $582 on mistakes, like one, frying the ECU that I got a really good deal on. It was an Elite 750 for $450, and then other stuff like getting the wrong fittings, extra hoses that I didn't need, and incorrect sizes, shipping costs because I had to resend things, and just stuff like that. So let's say this build is done. This will be in the future, obviously, but what am I gonna do after this? Plans are, I've obviously got a business I'm trying to start and keep running. And I'd like to keep making YouTube videos. That'd be a lot of fun. But as far as cars go, future builds, obviously Celicas would be fun. I'd like to try other cars too, but my dream car to build is a 7th gen Celica like this, make it mid-engine, which I've seen people do, and I specifically want to put in a 2GR engine because I love the way it sounds. I don't know why specifically, but it sounds kind of like an F1 car, and I like the high revving sound, but at idle it's like a deep throaty. I'd love to put one of those on an all-wheel drive transmission, and I'd preferably like it manual, at least like paddle shifters on it. That would be a lot of fun. And I'd also like to make a tube chassis, and a nice goal would be under 2,000 pounds. And at least like 500, 600 horsepower to the wheel. That would be pretty cool. Now that's not gonna be for a while because, like I said, I still work at Walmart and I don't have the nicest place or nicest tools to be building something of that quality, which I would like it to be. But if I get to that point, that's one of the ideas I have, and I think that would be a lot of fun to do, and I'm pretty sure you guys would really enjoy that too. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I really love this build, and I hope you guys stick around to see more of it because it will be being worked on soon. I hope you guys have a great day, and like and subscribe to see more, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.